This isn't arrogance, and it's not stubbornness either. When someone refuses to say, "I'm sorry," you've probably told yourself the same story everyone does. They're too proud. They don't care. They just want to win. But that label is wrong. What you're witnessing isn't confidence or dominance. It's a psychological defense system under threat. For some people, apologizing doesn't register as a simple social repair. It registers as danger, not because they don't understand they made a mistake, but because admitting it feels like collapsing the entire structure they use to stay intact. An apology doesn't feel like accountability. It feels like exposure, like losing ground, like confirming a fear they've spent their whole life running from. Most people misunderstand this behavior because they focus on the argument. They miss what's actually happening inside the person who won't apologize. So here's the real question, not why won't they say sorry, but what does an apology represent inside their internal world that makes it feel unbearable? In this video, we're not going to moralize this behavior or excuse it. We're going to name it correctly. You'll understand the fragile ego structures, the cognitive distortions, and the fear of ego collapse that turn two simple words into a perceived psychological threat. Because once you understand what an apology means to them, their behavior stops looking confusing and starts looking disturbingly consistent. Let's begin. For most emotionally healthy people, an apology is a bridge. It's a way of saying, "I made a mistake, but we're still okay." The self stays intact. The relationship gets repaired. But for some people, that bridge doesn't exist. Inside their mind, an apology doesn't feel like accountability. It feels like collapse. This is where the idea of a fragile ego matters. Not ego in the arrogant sense, but ego as identity, the internal structure that holds together who someone believes they are. When that structure is healthy, it can bend. It can take impact without breaking. A mistake is something you did, not something you are. But when the ego is fragile, there is no separation. A mistake isn't processed as, "I did something wrong." It lands as, "I am wrong." And that difference changes everything. Saying "I'm sorry" doesn't just acknowledge a behavior, it threatens the entire self-image. It feels like admitting incompetence, moral failure, unworthiness, as if one crack will cause the whole identity to shatter. So the nervous system does what it was designed to do: protect. The denial, the deflection, the silence. These aren't always calculated choices. Often, they're reflexes, automatic survival responses against a perceived psychological threat. To apologize would mean standing face to face with a fear that's been buried for years. The fear of not being enough, of being exposed, of being fundamentally flawed. So they don't apologize, not because they don't understand the harm, but because, to them, apologizing feels like emotional self-destruction. And from the outside, it looks like pride, but from the inside, it feels like survival. A fragile ego doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't always look arrogant or domineering. In fact, it often hides behind competence, confidence, even moral certainty. From the outside, this person may seem strong, unshakable, always sure of themselves. But psychologically, a fragile ego works like glass, rigid, clear, and dangerously easy to crack. What makes it fragile isn't weakness, it's inflexibility. The inability to bend without breaking. In a healthy inner structure, identity is spacious. There's room for contradiction, room for mistakes. You can hold the truth that you are a good person and that you sometimes cause harm. Those two realities don't cancel each other out. But when identity is narrow, when self-worth is built on being right, competent, or blameless, there is no margin for error. One misstep threatens the whole structure, so the system compensates. Certainty replaces curiosity. Defensiveness replaces reflection. Control replaces connection. This is why conversations with someone who has a fragile ego feel so exhausting. There's no shared space to explore what happened. Everything turns into a debate, a justification, a reframing of facts. Not because they enjoy conflict, but because conflict feels safer than collapse. Underneath that rigidity is usually a deep vulnerability that never had protection. Many people with fragile egos learned early on that mistakes were not met with repair, but with shame. That being wrong led to withdrawal of love, criticism, or humiliation. Over time, their psyche learned a rule: never bend, because bending once meant breaking completely. So the ego hardened, not to dominate but to survive. And this is the tragedy of the fragile ego. The very armor that once protected them now prevents the one thing that could actually heal them: honest accountability and emotional repair. They aren't defending their position, they're defending their existence. One of the most unsettling parts of dealing with someone who never apologizes is this feeling. They don't just deny responsibility, they seem to genuinely believe their version of events. This isn't always manipulation. Often, it's something more subtle and more powerful. Psychology calls it cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance occurs when a person's actions clash with their self-image. If someone believes, "I am fair, reasonable, and a good person," but they've just said something cruel or broken a promise, the mind experiences intense internal tension. That tension has to go somewhere. In a healthy system, it leads to reflection, to guilt, to repair. But when the ego is fragile, reflection feels too dangerous. So the mind chooses a different path. Instead of changing the self-image, it changes reality. I wasn't yelling, I was just being honest. They're too sensitive. If they hadn't pushed me, this wouldn't have happened. Honestly, I don't even remember it that way. Over time, these small revisions harden into certainty. The rewritten story becomes the truth they live inside. And once that happens, an apology doesn't make sense because, in their mind, there is nothing to apologize for. What makes this especially painful for the other person is that it creates a psychological trap. You remember what happened clearly. You felt its impact in your body, but now you're being told it wasn't real, or it didn't matter, or you misunderstood. So you start double-checking yourself. Maybe my tone was wrong. Maybe I exaggerated. Maybe I'm being unfair. This is how cognitive dissonance spreads outward. One person avoids inner conflict by offloading it onto someone else. And slowly, the relationship stops being about what actually happened and becomes about whose reality survives. Not because truth disappeared, but because one person's nervous system couldn't afford to face it. To truly understand why some people cannot apologize, we have to look beneath behavior and into emotion. Not all discomfort after doing harm is the same. There are two very different emotional experiences at play: guilt and shame. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." It's uncomfortable, but it's specific. And because it's specific, it's workable. Guilt keeps the self intact while pointing to the behavior that needs repair. It allows a person to say, "I messed up and I want to make this right." Shame is something else entirely. Shame says, "I am wrong, not just flawed but defective, unacceptable, exposed." And shame doesn't move outward toward repair. It collapses inward. It floods the system with a sense of threat. The body tightens. The mind searches for escape, because if being bad feels unbearable, then the only way to survive is to push that feeling away entirely. This is where apologies disappear. For someone dominated by shame, apologizing isn't relief, it's confirmation of their worst fear. That they are fundamentally unworthy. That once seen clearly, they'll be rejected or abandoned. So instead of turning toward responsibility, they turn toward defense. They minimize, they deflect, they attack, they go silent. From the outside, it looks cold or uncaring. But internally, it's often a person drowning in an emotion they were never taught how to process safely. And here's the painful irony. Shame was meant to protect them from loss, but by avoiding guilt and refusing repair, they create exactly what they fear most: disconnection, distance, and emotional isolation. Not because they don't care, but because caring feels too dangerous to face. Most people assume that apologizing is instinctive, that when you hurt someone, your conscience naturally leads you toward repair. But the truth is quieter and far more important. Apologizing is a learned skill. We learn it not through lectures, but through experience, through watching what happens after harm, through moments where rupture is followed by repair. And for some people, those moments never happened. They grew up in environments where mistakes weren't met with understanding, but with shame, where being wrong meant being criticized, dismissed, or emotionally abandoned. In some families, parents never apologized, not to their children, not to each other. Authority was absolute. Accountability flowed only downward. In that kind of world, a child learns a dangerous equation: being wrong equals being unsafe. There was no model for saying, "I messed up, and I still love you." No moment where harm was acknowledged and then softened by care. No experience of conflict that ended in closeness. So, the nervous system adapted. It learned to avoid admission, to defend quickly, to stay rigid rather than risk humiliation. By the time that child becomes an adult, this avoidance doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like truth. Apologies don't register as repair. They register as exposure, as a step toward losing respect, control, or belonging. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. People who never learned repair aren't incapable of connection. They're afraid of the exact moment that makes connection real, the moment where vulnerability meets accountability, because no one ever showed them that after "I'm sorry," the relationship doesn't end, it deepens. So when you're waiting for an apology that never comes, you may be standing across from someone who never experienced repair as safety, only as risk. Not because they don't value the relationship, but because, to their nervous system, repair was never survivable. One of the most confusing effects of being close to someone who never apologizes is what starts happening inside you. At first, you're clear. You know what was said. You know what you felt. The impact is real in your body. Tight chest, racing thoughts, that quiet drop in your stomach. But as the conversation drags on without repair, something begins to shift. You start questioning yourself. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe my tone made it worse. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. This isn't weakness. It's a nervous system searching for stability. When there's no acknowledgement, no shared reality, your mind tries to close the gap on its own. Humans are wired for coherence. When someone refuses to name what happened, the brain doesn't conclude. They're avoiding accountability. It often concludes, "I must be wrong." Over time, this creates a subtle psychological erosion. You stop bringing things up. You rehearse conversations in your head before speaking. You downplay your feelings to keep the peace. Not because you don't care, but because caring without repair hurts too much. This is how emotional freeze begins. The body learns that expression leads nowhere, so it conserves energy. It goes quiet. It adapts. And then one day, you look at yourself and wonder how you became someone who doubts their own memory, their own reactions, their own right to be affected. Here's what matters. Feeling confused around someone who never apologizes doesn't mean you're unstable. It means you've been living in a relationship where your reality is consistently left unacknowledged, and no nervous system stays grounded for long in that kind of silence. In some relationships, the refusal to apologize isn't just emotional avoidance, it's strategy. Silence becomes a way to hold the upper hand. In a mindset shaped by competition or hierarchy, conflict isn't something to repair. It's something to win. And in that framework, an apology is interpreted as surrender, a loss of status, proof of weakness. So instead of repair, there's withdrawal. Instead of accountability, there's calm indifference. Instead of dialogue, there's distance. From the outside, this can look like confidence, like emotional self-control, like strength, but psychologically, it's something else entirely. It's control. By refusing to engage, the non-apologist keeps the other person waiting, hoping, explaining, softening. The power imbalance grows quietly. One person is reaching for connection. The other is deciding if and when it will be granted. This dynamic is common in environments where authority was never questioned, in rigid households, competitive workplaces, or relationships where dominance mattered more than mutuality. But here's the cost that often goes unseen. Silence may preserve control in the moment, but it slowly dismantles trust. Intimacy can't survive where accountability is treated as defeat. What remains isn't strength, it's distance. And distance isn't power. It's the absence of safety, slowly mistaken for stability. When apologies never happen, nothing actually resolves. The argument may end, the conversation may stop, but the rupture remains, unspoken, unhealed, and relationships don't break all at once. They erode. Without repair, there is no closure. Without closure, the nervous system stays alert, waiting for a resolution that never arrives. Each unresolved moment stacks quietly on top of the last. Small disappointments harden into resentment. Hope turns into guardedness. The person waiting for accountability doesn't usually explode. They adapt. They share less. They ask for less. They expect less. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring without repair becomes too painful to sustain. Over time, something more serious is lost. Shared reality. When one person consistently refuses to acknowledge impact, the other learns that their inner world isn't safe to bring forward. Their emotions become inconvenient. Their experiences become negotiable, so they disengage. Emotionally first, then psychologically, and eventually, physically or relationally. The non-apologist may believe they've maintained strength, that by not conceding, they've preserved dignity or authority. But what they've actually preserved is distance. They didn't lose the argument, they lost the bond. And by the time they notice the emptiness, the silence, the withdrawal, the absence of warmth, the opportunity for repair has often already passed. Because relationships don't end when conflict appears, they end when repair stops happening. Real accountability doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't come with self-punishment or humiliation. It's quiet, grounded, human. It sounds like, I see what I did. I understand how it affected you. I care enough to stay present with the discomfort. True accountability separates behavior from identity. It allows someone to admit harm without collapsing into shame. To say, I was wrong, without believing that being wrong makes them unworthy of connection. And this is the part many people need to hear. You cannot force someone into accountability if they aren't ready to face themselves. No amount of explaining, softening, or waiting will create repair where there is no willingness to look inward. But you are not powerless. You can validate your own experience, even when it goes unacknowledged. You can set boundaries that protect your emotional reality, and you can choose distance when repair is consistently refused. Because relationships don't survive on being right. They survive on repair. If this video helped you recognize a pattern in someone else, or even in yourself, you're not alone. This channel exists for these quieter psychological dynamics that rarely get talked about. If you want more conversations like this, consider subscribing, and if you feel comfortable, share in the comments. What does accountability look like to you, and where did you first learn it? Your story might be the moment someone else feels understood. Thank you for watching.